Alright, so and welcome back to the world of Hearts of Iron 4, and it's been a while since I've been here. And today I want to explore the capabilities of Japan going against Germany. Now, Japan constitutes one of the few major powers, one of the two major powers, so to say, which have an immense amount of flexibility when choosing which side to actually join in, or which side to go up against, more rather. The other one being Italy, which is kind of interesting, but Japan, apart from other than Italy, more rather, is actually the more powerful of the two. So today we'll be taking a look at Japan and how Japan is able to possibly counter Germany or fight against Germany, because the standard historical situation that you usually go down is, of course, fighting against the Allies, purging or supporting the Kadoha faction, more rather, has you fighting against the Soviet Union. However, Japan tends not to fight against Germany, both on historical settings and the alternate historical path, which has you fighting against the Soviet Union. However, fighting against the Axis, which is obviously the third or the fourth major faction in this case, Japan doesn't really do too often, and I haven't really explored the possibilities of doing something like that ever, really, and I don't think many people have. So today we'll be doing exactly that. We'll be taking a look at the capabilities of Japan going up against Germany. Now, to balance the situation and to understand properly how this situation is going to play out, the individual factors at work. So, as you said at the beginning, I decided to annex and core both Manchukuo and Meguko because I hate puppets. I really hate integrated puppets in this game, and while Manchukuo and Meguko sometimes can be semi-useful, I think that overall they aren't necessarily all that important for me not to annex them. And regardless, even if we were to go down the quote-unquote proper route to annex them, meaning building stuff in their territory and just sending them Lend-Lease, it would take like 1 to 2 years. So realistically, I would have annexed them either way. However, this way I gain less resources, less industry from the whole ordeal. However, I do gain basically the same amount of manpower, and I have to deal with much less of a hassle. So I'm definitely going to pick that option. On the other side, the Axis side, I decided to unite the Scandinavian Empire, which is Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, make them turn fascist and join the Axis. Same thing with Greece. And in the game settings, I set Portugal to eventually turn fascist and join the Axis, which should balance things out when you actually count the number of factories that Japan, along with Manchukuo and Meguko, has, and the amount of manpower this situation provides for the Axis and the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, respectively. Then it's the same. Basically, it balances each other out. Not to mention that because Japan is going to be fighting against the Germans, the USA should not join the war under any circumstances, because the USA is set to only join the war after Pearl Harbor or in this game, Philippines have been attacked, or after Japan joins the Axis, or essentially after Japan goes against the Allies. Now, with that all being said, this game should be perfectly balanced, as all things should be, and we'll just have to see how things pan out, because this is something I don't think many people have done. Usually, if you go against Germany as Japan, you tend to go down the democratic path. And we'll be exploring the democratic path a little bit later down the line in this little video series, because I do really want to explore all the capabilities of Japan going up against Germany. However, this time we are exploring the historical Japan route, or the fascist route, more rather, which, actually wasn't all that fascist when you actually take a look at the individual sources, but, whatever. We'll be exploring the standard purging the Kadoha faction route and then going up against Germany. Now, with Germany gaining the Scandinavian Empire and Greece and eventually Portugal, and the USA not actually joining the war, this should mean that the Axis actually do have an advantage against us, but I think we'll manage, because I think that Japan is probably the most powerful nation in this entire game. Because, as I said, it's probably one of the two most flexible great powers in the entire game, the other one being Italy. However, Italy has a terrible navy. Well, the navy is rather large, and against someone like France is actually decent. I would say that the Italian navy is roughly around the same power level as the French navy. However, against someone like Britain or the United States or even Japan, the Italian navy isn't really all that great. The Italian infantry can be great if you go down the mass assault doctrine route, and you try to sort of balance German panzer capabilities with your infantry capabilities, or American panzer, or Russian tank capabilities, something like that. You just have really good defensive divisions up against your opponent. Then you can be a really big annoyance towards your opponents. However, overall, because of the individual advisors, the sort of glass ceiling of Italian infantry is rather low. It's you can't really do that much with the Italian infantry if you're going up against, let's say, Germany or the Soviet Union alone, and you don't really necessarily have a lot of experience, and you're sort of banking on using your infantry alone. Whereas Japan, on the other hand, is probably the best infantry nation in the entire game. Because you have a lot of good advisors, you have a lot of good passive sort of focuses or focuses that give you national spirits that do really boost up your infantry capabilities. And overall, I find that Japan has a pretty decent navy. It can be really powerful if you do build it up and you go with the naval sort of focuses within your decisions, or the naval decisions. But it can also be really great when it comes to resource management. It can be really great when it comes to the whole army size, not necessarily when it comes to the tanks. However, in comparison with someone like Germany, nobody's really going to be that great when it comes to tanks. So overall, I think Japan is probably the strongest nation in the entire game. At least it's my favorite nation to play as if you actually want to have fun. Now, when it comes to the mods that I'm going to be using, because there's a lot of factors that play into this entire situation, and it's necessary to analyze them individually. Now, obviously, I'm using the anime no Sekai mod because we're playing as Japan, and it would be heresy not to use an anime mod when playing as Japan. Did I say Germany? Yeah. Japan. We're playing as Japan, not Germany, and so we're using an anime mod. I'm also using the extended advisors, which does give both the player and the AI an ability to choose more advisors than they would normally be able to. I find that it sort of gives you flexibility, and it's sort of just more fun. I'm also using the extended decisions and formable nations mod. I think that's the name. And I'm also using the EU4 decisions mod. And this whole situation is sort of both a positive and a negative for me, because obviously I have the ability to pick more decisions, and thus use my political power more efficiently and gear my country towards the way I want to play it. However, the AI also has the ability to do something like that, and with more nations being within the axis, that means that there's a more diverse, let's say, scheme of various decisions and national focuses picked against me, and but obviously also the allies and the Comintern, and basically every nation has the ability to do something like that. So, the way I'm going to be playing Japan in this game is very sort of standardish. I'm going down the Grand Battle Plan. I'm sort of staying on limited exports, I think it is, and I'm not necessarily going to be going sort of haywire with a more like American focus tree or an American American superior firepower doctrine, I meant to say, and I'm not necessarily going to be focusing on artillery or tanks. I'm just going to be using standard 7.2, not necessarily going to be upgrading the navy that much, not necessarily going to be sort of swaying from the standard way the Japanese fought. So no real tanks, no real like extremely heavy artillery, just mostly infantry. That's the best way to play Japan, in my opinion, when it comes to land combat, because Japan has some really good modifiers, and so I'll be doing that. And I think that's an interesting counterweight to Germany, because Germany is obviously more focused on tanks and just various, tech, I would say. They have a very diverse opportunity to actually, there's a very diverse way to play Germany. You can play it in any way you actually want, whereas Japan is more flexible in its political decisions. However, their army, the army style or the military tactics that you would more standardly employ is sort of more strict. You don't necessarily have a lot of options when it comes to the way that you would play Japan. Obviously, someone like Tommy K, who is an expert at playing Japan in multiplayer and both single player, I am pretty sure that he's pretty good at both. Now, he probably has just about a strategy for everything, but I like to play Japan in the more infantry-focused way, because if you actually look at the way that Japan fought the Second World War, they didn't use many tanks. Their artillery capabilities were rather limited, so it's infantry and naval focus. That's sort of the way that I play Japan. And I think it's sort of standard in single player, at least. I don't really play multiplayer, because they don't tend to use the anime no Sekai mod, and that's just a big old no from me then. I'm just not going to play without the anime no Sekai mod. Oh god. But yeah, it's just an interesting experiment. So I'll be focusing on the Allied side this time. We'll be focusing on trying to support the Allies as much as possible, because obviously in this game, because Japan is not going to go to war against the United States, the US is not going to get into the war. And with the Axis boosted as much as I did boost them, obviously, they do have an easy pathway into Africa, and they also have a very threatening position when it comes to the British Isles. I think I'll be trying to support the British Isles or the United Kingdom as much as possible this time, both with the Navy and the Army. And I think that's a relatively interesting way of looking at it. But we'll be staying within the sphere of the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, as within the alliance, because whenever you increase world tension too much, as basically any nation, it could be fascist, democratic, communist even. I think the democracies have a very easy way of actually staying within the Allied faction. But, for example, a fascist Japan has a very hard time actually staying within the Allies, because the United Kingdom constantly kicks you out, which is, I think that's incredibly stupid. I think that's like probably one of the stupidest ways to handle the whole being liked or disliked by the Alliance leader mechanic that they could have implemented into this game. I think that you should be able to be kicked out of a faction, or you should be sort of kicked out of such a faction at the end of the war, maybe after you won, or basically after you won. But or if you're not currently engaged in a military conflict. However, if, for example, the Allied leader or the leader of the faction, so let's say United Kingdom, is losing terribly, surely they would want you in the faction, but instead Churchill constantly kicks you out. So I think it's a terrible mechanic, or at least it's an interesting mechanic that hasn't really been implemented all that well, and I think it should be sort of, I don't know, should be redone at least a tiny bit, because the way it stands right now, it's sort of dumb. So we'll be staying within the Japanese faction, even though we're probably going to be the only member of it, because Siam or Thailand, no, that's a country I'd like to go to, but Siam, is sometimes finicky when it comes to joining wars, or even joining the alliance in the first place. So, I think that sums up the initial phase. So we've had 14 minutes of me babbling on about the individual aspects that go into this overall match, but the overall game, I suppose. But it's a rather long video, so what you get what you came for, I suppose. But overall, the main focus again is Japan versus Germany. Now, what you have to take into account, though, is that we don't necessarily have a direct pathway to Germany. So this will be a very very interesting experience in that it tests the military capabilities, not for example the the survivability of Japan when it comes to fighting a direct land war against Germany on its borders, because that's a whole entire different situation. Might be interesting to test something like that out in the future as well, where maybe essentially you split the Soviet Union in half. Half of it gets annexed by Japan, the other half of it gets puppeted or annexed by Germany, and you try to fight that one out. However, that's such a stretch of a situation. That's such a strange scenario. It's such a man in the high castle scenario that I don't think it's within the realms of really happening all that too often, and so I think we'll suffice with this scenario right here. It also showcases how sometimes maybe pointless the United States is if you're planning to play sort of maybe a Japan-Soviet co-op game or Japan-Britain co-op game, and you want to fight against Germany or someone like that, because Japan essentially figures as the United States within this scenario, with reduced industrial, naval, and military power. However, you're only fighting against one enemy, so essentially half of the United States power level, but only focused against a single enemy. So I think that's an interesting scenario that we find ourselves here. It also sort of lets you put into contrast the different capabilities of Japan and the United States more directly, because you're fighting, we're going to be fighting against the same enemy essentially, which is Germany. But since we're playing the initial years of fascist Japan in a more historical fashion, we have to take every precaution when it comes to the aggression and escalation of the Chinese on the mainland. And we know, Japan knows, the Japanese nation knows, and the emperor knows that they have been truly irresponsible in the past when it comes to their aggression. And there we go, the Marco Polo Bridge incident. What in Aramitama's name are they doing this time? Well, this is truly irresponsible behavior from the side of the Chinese, and we'll have to take harsh measures when it comes to countering such aggression. However, first, there are a very few, however very important steps that we have to take. The first step is to escalate the war in China. The second step is to escalate the war in China. The third step is to escalate the war in China. The fourth step is to escalate the war in China. And the final step before Shirapan Susaksen is to, again, escalate the war in China. The operation can begin. Nothing to see here, folks. Nothing to see here at all. Just a regular visit of the Chinese capital. Well, we managed to grind our generals to a relatively interesting degree, and we managed to take over the entirety of China, and all of the Chinese warlords within sort of an interesting period of time. Wasn't too long, wasn't too short. It certainly gave us the ability to at least grind the journals properly, which is certainly the best thing that Japan has going for it when it comes to the pre-war or the pre-Second World War years, is that you have the ability to really grind your generals and really stack up those boosts when it comes to your infantry. However, for a little while now, we'll be just chilling out, as essentially we won't really be doing that much, just building up the industrial base and the resources and our armed forces, and basically doing everything like that in preparation of actually taking on Germany. And we'll try to, I guess, declare war on Slovakia because it's a German puppet, and that will put us directly at war with Germany. It turns out that democratic Spain actually managed to win the conflict, even though they were up against the anarchist faction, they were up against the Carlists, and they were up against the nationalists, as well as fascist Portuguese volunteers which were sent to nationalist Spain. So the democratic side had to ally itself with the Soviet Union, which is rather interesting. So that means that the Axis will be fighting against Spain whenever they try to go up against the Soviet Union. So I suppose that's an interesting development. Certainly sort of balances things out, I suppose, because we don't necessarily have a United States on the Allied side. So that's going to be interesting, definitely. However, I do remember that the Spanish tend to sort of declare war upon the Soviets whenever stuff actually goes down, so we'll have to see how things develop. However, we'll be moving forward towards the actual war now. So I'm jumping in right into the middle of the conflict. One thing that really surprised me when playing this was just how effective the Japanese Navy was at completely annihilating the Axis Navy when it comes to both dealing with the submarine threat as well as their convoys, and sort of just really establishing a proper blockade while also dealing with the Axis submarine blockade that's very present within the game, and sort of the tendency that you see with the Germans deploying their navy all across the Atlantic. One reason why this might be the case is that in comparison with the Americans and the British, in this situation, the Japanese can deploy their entire navy against the Germans within the Pacific, or within the Atlantic, I mean. While in a regular game where the Japanese and the entirety of the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere tends to go against the Allies, the British and the Americans really have to sort of split their navy in half, and thus the British really do struggle with, for example, fuel. Whereas in this game, I suppose in this case, both me and the British just, traded for oil with America, who wasn't engaged in any sort of conflict and didn't really need the oil at all. So the trade was sort of easy to get, because the Pacific was relatively safe. There were virtually no Axis ships in the Pacific. Apart from, I think, a few Portuguese convoys because of their colonial holdings, which I very quickly dealt with, so to say, because that's just free real estate, sort of a similar situation to the Japanese in the First World War, where they just took over a bunch of German holdings. In this case, in the Second World War of this universe, we took out a whole bunch of Portuguese, I suppose, colonies or colonial holdings, and it didn't really cost us anything, and we just sunk a bunch of convoys. So I think that's the extent of the Pacific campaign within this game. However, it plays an interesting factor and just goes to show how the Japanese do play quite an important role in the game overall, because, well, the United States don't even get involved in this game, for example. They haven't joined the Allies at all, and they don't, I think, go down any sort of focus tree decision line that would allow them to declare war on either Vichy France or the German Reich or Italy or anything like that when it comes to historical games. The Mexicans, I do think, join the Allies because that's just an independent decision that they can take. They tend to join the Allies during a very similar period of time that the United States joins the Allies, meaning right after the Pearl Harbor attack or an attack against the Philippines, or the various Allied colonial holdings within the Pacific and in Asia and stuff like that. However, the Mexicans don't tend to play an important role, apart from maybe sending a division or two, which is quite a shame because the Mexicans can really pack a punch sometimes. But what I found most interesting was that the combined Anglo-Japanese naval power is sufficient to just completely stomp the Axis naval forces, I suppose, the Axis navy into the ground without any real effort. I expected before this game to sort of really struggle in the naval department between the Italian and German navy, and in combination with the Scandinavian Empire's navy, which has a lot of naval potential if you actually count all the naval factories and the dockyards, and even the baseline navy that Norway, Sweden and Denmark start out with. I really expected it to be sort of a struggle, and in combination with the really good air power that the Axis have, for the for me just to completely struggle in that department. But surprisingly, even though I wasn't really able to bring out my air forces at all, because when you're in a different faction you can't actually send your airplanes into the airports of your, let's say, allied, not necessarily allied, but the other faction that you're basically fighting in a war together against the Axis or against a different faction, which is again a stupid mechanic, but hey, what you gonna do? Even though I wasn't able to use my air force at all, essentially, within this game, we still managed to just completely dominate the naval game, even though obviously neither Britain nor Japan has any sort of reliable sources of oil apart from maybe South Sakhalin and the various refineries that you have to rely on. Basically all our oil came from the trade with America. So it kind of goes to show that the United States, in essence, is really hampered by the Pacific War when it comes to, and also obviously the United Kingdom and the Allies in general, really hampered by the Japanese in this game on historical settings, which if you're playing on historical and the AI is and you basically just have the AI battle that entire front out, it really shows. The AI is really terrible at handling their navies, and for some reason the Japanese AI is really good at handling like naval invasions and navies in general, but like the British and American AI is really bad at that whole situation. Another interesting factor is the Portuguese navy. For some reason the Portuguese had really lots of convoys this game, like a metric ton of convoys this game, which I really didn't expect, because they just baseline start out with just a few destroyers and maybe a heavy cruiser, if I remember correctly. But they seem to focus their entire naval efforts and their entire naval output on just building convoys, which is interesting. I thought that the AI would focus more on the naval side of things. However, instead the Scandinavian Empire, or just the Swedish AI, focused quite a bit on the naval side of things, and actually tried to build some heavier ships. Not necessarily carriers, because their economy can't necessarily sustain something like that, but they really did put up quite a fight. It's actually more interesting when I take into consideration that I really didn't focus on the naval department this game at all, which tends to happen. I really neglect the navy and really tend to focus more on just the combat side of things. Even if you're playing like a standard Japanese game where you go up against the Americans, the naval side of things usually doesn't play too big of a role, because you keep your navy stationed around the core Japanese islands and the mainland of Asia, so that you don't get invaded, and you essentially just kamikaze strike the entire American and English Navy into the ground water, into the waters, into the depths, I suppose. And you win through that engagement, just destroying their navy with really high-tech, high-quality zeros, and just completely annihilating them that way. So that's an interesting part of it. But yeah, so that was actually kind of unexpected. So the Japanese really do perform well in the naval department, even when they are basically carrying the British, because the British AI is really terrible at handling the navy. Because they tend to run out of fuel basically in the first 5 seconds, and the AI doesn't really take that into consideration. So that's interesting. That's interesting. So from a certain point of view, this was just Japanese Navy against the entire Axis Navy. Apart from the Mediterranean, that's one part where I didn't really engage in, because that's the sort of I don't know, that's the sphere of the of the Italian air forces, and I really didn't want to engage there because we didn't necessarily have a big front anywhere near to the Mediterranean because of the Greeks being aligned with the Axis. So there was no real need to even go there, because usually when you're playing as an allied nation or a nation fighting against the Axis, you want to sort of at least help the Greeks a little bit with air power. So you do want to take control of the different islands such as Crete, and keep control of Cyprus and Malta, and then take over Sicily, stuff like that. The standard strategy if you're playing single player and you try to keep Greece alive, which is sort of in the department of, for example, India and Britain, and maybe a little bit France, but not too much. So the Mediterranean is sort of pointless apart from that. Maybe if you're trying to invade Italy, it's really good, but yeah, you really need to have a lot of air power for that. And as I said, in this game, I wasn't really able to bring up the air power, so I just completely neglected the Mediterranean overall. Because in terms of like naval power, if you're not actually going to invade Italy, if you're incapable of invading Italy because you're lacking air power, there's no need to bring out the navy to the Mediterranean. It's sort of an interesting sphere. Because as long as you're controlling the entirety of the Atlantic and you do have a route around the south of Africa, or through southern Africa, or through South Africa as a nation, then there's really no need to even bother about the Mediterranean. But overall, when it comes to like the actual land engagement of infantry within Africa itself, it really helps to have a really good and grinded up general, more specifically the field marshal, that you try and level up while fighting in China, because China really has bad logistics. Let's say it's a very bad supply situation in China, so your general has a good opportunity to grind the logistics expert. And that really helps out in Africa and the African continent, even more so if you actually have the logistics companies within your divisions. And that turns Japan into... it really puts them into an interesting position, because so far it seems like they're just good at everything. They're good in the naval department, they completely stomp the Axis, and they can definitely hold their own against the Anglo-American navies for a few years. If they're controlled by the AI, if they're controlled by the player, they again stomp because of kamikaze strikes from the mainland of Asia. If you're fighting in the low supply area, then they have a really good opportunity to sort of basically fighting in Africa is what I mean. They have a really good experience from fighting in China, and if you're playing the standard fascist route, of course, to just put those logistics companies and the logistics expert trait of their field marshal to good use. And of course they have the best infantry overall in the game. So far it seems like Japan is just good at everything, apart from maybe the armor strategy. And if you're trying to fight out sort of a resource war against America or the Soviet Union, then that's where the Japanese do kind of struggle with. But as far as you're only fighting against either the United States or only against the Axis, or only against the Comintern, without engaging in an unnecessary two-front war, let's say. It seems like after you finish off China, after you try and sort of rebuild the entire region, at least somewhat, to try and gain those resources, it seems like it seems like Japan in single player is just almost unbeatable if you know what you're doing, which could be, the case for almost any nation. But for example, Germany, sometimes a German player can really struggle to push through the Benelux if France goes for extended fortifications and the Netherlands does flood their entire country, and maybe maybe Belgium and Luxembourg do build some forts. It seems like they could struggle. I've certainly had experiences where if you give the Allies enough time, then really Germany struggles because their power comes from trying to basically Bewegungskrieg their way out into Central, Eastern, and Western Europe and take power that has been sort of in France from the beginning of the game, as well as the Benelux region. And in contrast to that, Japan really, after taking over China, which is like the easiest thing ever, you can do that with like a 10 KD ratio, let's say, 10 to 1 losses for Chinese compared to Japanese. It's after you do that, after you take out into China, or just take control of it through a decision or through the focus tree, it seems like there's almost nothing that could really assail Japan if you know what you're doing, if you try to play to your strengths, especially if you're fighting against the Axis and making use of the Allies. It seems that there's almost nothing that directly threatens you, because the Germans essentially either have to build up enough of a navy to dominate the Anglo-Japanese navy and then navally invade you somehow in like 1950, or push through the entirety of the Soviet Union to eventually try and take over China and then eventually navally invade you, which is like the most unrealistic scenario ever. It seems almost less realistic than if you're playing as the United States and actually fearing that the Germans might navally invade you, because you only have to cross the Atlantic. But if you're playing as Japan, you might be in a safer spot than the United States, technically, if you're fighting against the Axis. Because, one scenario, of course, which could happen is that Italy and Germany take over Africa together, and then from there they could easily navally invade, India, and from India it's sort of a straighter shot to China, and then they have to navally invade Japan. It still seems extensively unrealistic compared to them trying to fight off against the United States and navally invading the United States, because it's a longer distance and it's just not as convenient as just crossing the Atlantic, which isn't convenient in the first place, obviously. So overall, I do think that when it comes to fighting in Africa and the naval war, it seems like Japan excels at those two things when fighting against Germany quite well. However, one very big issue that you tend to find, I suppose, in this scenario is that when you actually get to France, or to the mainland of Europe, the Panzer Force that the Germans have, even while they're at war with the Soviet Union, which happened this game, they were at war with the Soviet Union, we managed to invade Germany through Spain, because Spain was obviously aligned with the Comintern, they were allies of the Comintern, so we managed to invade into France through there. It seems that when fighting with predominantly, which is obviously the case if you're fighting with a predominantly infantry force, which Japan tends to be, you really struggle against the German tanks. You really, really struggle against the German tanks. Not to mention the supply situation is so much worse when you have allies on your side that just flood the entire front line, willy-nilly, not necessarily taking into account basically anything. They just flood it with trash troops that don't help you at all, and just completely make the entire experience miserable as hell. And then you encounter the German tanks. It's incredibly bad. So this is one scenario, and this is one aspect in which the Japanese do extremely badly against the Axis. Because maybe against Italy it'll be fine, but obviously Italy isn't a major Axis force. It's a big nation. It's of course a major Axis force, but it's not the biggest. It's not Germany, is what I'm trying to say. Germany is the main foe in this scenario, obviously, and German tanks just shred you to pieces. They just completely annihilate you if you're not paying attention, if you're not microing properly. And in this game, what I tried to do was just, make use of the Japanese Marines and the naval dominance that we have in combination with the fact that Germany can really try and hold both the front lines and the ports at the same time. So I tried to make use of that. It was somewhat successful, but again, you make little advances. You push for like 3 tiles, 4 tiles, and then the German tanks arrive. And then you're kind of, screwed, because you don't necessarily have anything to deal with that. You can equip your infantry with anti-tank units or anti-tank battalions. That can only get you so far, and it sort of weakens you against the German infantry. I was sort of hoping that the Allies would help me with this. Maybe the British could bring in their own tanks, but obviously that never happens. The AI never listens to you. So this might be an interesting scenario in a co-op game if you're playing again that Anglo-Japanese co-op, or the co-op between the United Kingdom and Japan. It might be interesting to see sort of a combination where the Japanese maybe focus more on the infantry side of things, and the British focus more on the tank side of things. That could be interesting. But even the British tanks don't necessarily always stand a chance against the German tanks, and Japanese tanks are just not a thing at all. If you really want to have a proper infantry force, and a proper infantry force is what Japan excels at. If you're not doing infantry, there's you're sort of hampering yourself. So you might want to go down the anti-tank route. But again, are you willing to completely shift your entire sort of division template mid-war and sort of try and be flexible like that? It's possible, but if you want to have a speedy invasion, that's sometimes not necessarily the right thing to do. Sometimes you just need that infantry in France as quickly as possible. So that's the one scenario which I think that the Japanese are really bad at when fighting from the Allied point of view, when fighting sort of from the British and French perspective, let's say. This is a sort of a scenario if, let's say, the fascist Japanese government, which wasn't really fascist, but it's fascist in this game, sort of, reignited the alliance with Britain somehow, and, helped them in France and Africa and stuff like that. In that point of view, the Japanese really do struggle on the mainland. I think they would be relatively okay if you manage to get into the war early enough. You sort of don't necessarily grind your generals against China too much. You only focus on nationalist China. Blitz them, get them out of the war very quickly. Then try and declare war on Germany at the same time as they're declaring a war against Poland, so that you get to help, let's say, France and their defense. Could really help hold the Maginot Line if you sort of gear your entire game plan around that. I think it would be very difficult. It might not be very convenient. It would be kind of a struggle, but I think that strategy might be possible. However, in this experiment that we're running, where the we're sort of doing a Japanese America, I suppose. We're sort of role-playing as a Japan that replaces America. It's really not going too well, is it? Especially because we chose the Grand Battle Plan Doctrine, which isn't very well suited to really large-scale operations against tanks. It's okay on the defensive. It might be okay, like in the situation right now, we are holding the front. They're not going to get through, But that means that it turns into World War I, and the British are constantly eating away at my supplies, and it's annoying. So, but they're not going to get through. Essentially, split France in half, and the main issue is that eventually Vichy France is going to get into war, and the overall situation is going to get really messy. It's a really messy situation now. They're not going to break through because the Japanese have really good infantry, and with the Grand Battle Plan Doctrine, they have really, really, really good defenses, especially if you pick the right advisors, and potentially with the EU4, extended decisions, or whatever you want to call it, you could really focus on the defensive and try to play it that way. You could gear your general traits towards that, and you can even sort of, as I was doing this game, just constantly decrypt the codes of both Italy and Germany and all the rest of the Axis forces that were actively engaged against my forces. You could try to do that to sort of hamper their advance even further. But again, it's sort of a grindy experience, and that's not something that you really want to see when you land in France, because it's a territory that's so well suited to the German tanks. It's really a big grind, and you might encounter some success in the sort of less defended areas of France, or areas of France that aren't so well prone to panzer attacks, for example down in the Alps or on the coastline, because the tanks don't necessarily have a good way of retreating from there. You can easily encircle them. You could easily, try and outmaneuver the tanks if they aren't in great strength, and if they aren't supported by very well-equipped infantry. So, for example, they could be supported by Bulgarians or the Vichy French or Romanians, stuff like that. But yeah, the Japanese really do struggle against German tanks in France specifically. Now that might be very different if we actually went with the Mediterranean strategy, but again, not possible because I am not able to bring my air force into allied airports. An alternative strategy which I thought about and which I subsequently tried out was to invade Scandinavia, and I don't show it in this match, or this game, or rather, it's not a match, it's a game, but it goes about the same, with even less success, because Scandinavia has terrible supply for major forces, and the Allies, because it's much easier to get to Scandinavia, or I don't know if the British AI is somehow coded to just swarm their entire army once you land in Scandinavia, but immediately I took like 3 ports, advanced like 4 tiles, virtually the entirety of the British army, even the forces that were supposed to be in Africa and North America, stuff like that. The entirety of the British army just swarmed in. Same thing happened here with France. So I don't know if the British AI is just sort of passive, waiting for an opportunity to swarm in. Maybe they're sort of hard-coded to follow the lead of the Americans in the mid to late war scenario after the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. Not entirely sure how that works, but it's terrible. So even within this scenario, even if you're playing sort of on historical without necessarily boosting the Germans arbitrarily, even if they take Norway, which tends to happen, they do take out Norway. It's and you invade Norway subsequently. The Norway occupied by Germany is what I mean. It's still quite a bit of a struggle because the British just swarm in, completely ruin your supply, and it's quite a bad experience. So yeah, the Japanese suck at fighting against German tanks, specifically in territory that is very well designed to get blitzed by German tanks, both in history and in this game. So you can't necessarily beat everything with just really good infantry. You can sort of turn it into a World War I situation where you just sort of, at least attempt to hold the Germans at bay while the Soviets do everything. But that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to destroy the Axis. But yeah, that needs some polishing. I think you might be able to do it if you potentially disband the Great Eastern Co-Prosperity Sphere and join the Allies and just completely bomb Germany to death. However, I'm not gonna sit here and just be constantly kicked out by Churchill every 5 seconds, only for me to rejoin every 5 seconds again, and have my air force just constantly swiveling around doing nonsense air movements. That's not necessarily what I'm trying to do here and what this experiment is about. And one thing that's really annoying about this game is that the individual units, when they see that there is not enough supply in the region that you're trying to send them to by just not micromanaging them, but just by the order, the front line order, what they tend to do is just sit in place and have that yellow exclamation mark next to their division counter, And it's even more annoying because they're eating supply, but they're not necessarily doing anything. So this overall situation, quite painful and quite annoying. Now, in the end, of course, we eventually managed to push through because the Germans got tired by fighting against the Soviets. That's something that, eventually happens, obviously, if the Allies are putting up enough pressure. In this case, it wasn't the Allies, it was the Japanese. But same thing, we managed to sort of stall their advance in the east by having them put a lot of force on the west in France just to sort of hold the line against us, and trying to bring their panzers in on the west really hampered their advance in the east again. So the strategy is interesting, fighting from the Allied perspective. However, I don't think it's very feasible. It relies too heavily on the actual capabilities of the Soviets when it comes to pushing Germans back. And that can be very finicky. Sometimes the Soviets have a lot of luck in defending their country, like in this game, and sometimes they completely suck, even though you're trying your best to support them. And the Allies can be sometimes passive. A good example of that would be my, not very recent, it's been a while, but a video I made about about communist New Zealand, where I sort of tried to really help the Soviets by any means necessary with, granted it was with New Zealand, but even so, it was an additional support on the Eastern Front that they wouldn't have usually. It wasn't in this version of the game, it was in the last version of the game, so things might have changed. However, still, even so, sometimes you do see, even in this patch, that the Germans just completely stomp and mop the floor with the Soviets because of the very early, powerful blitzkrieg national spirit that they do get. And that ultimately, gets reversed, and sometimes the Soviets can push back, sometimes they can't. All depends on how the Allies are doing, how the Germans are doing themselves, how the Italians manage to perform in Africa, etc., etc. And in this game, even though the Axis had a very good game because of the various countries that I sort of forcibly made put into the Axis, the Scandinavian Empire, Portugal, and Greece. So they had sort of an artificial boost. However, we sort of counteracted that by having the entirety of Asia fight on the side of the Allies. So it's I think it's sort of a fair game in that sense, because of course the Americans didn't join in, and we sort of acted as the Americans in this case. So in the end, the Japanese in this situation turn basically into the Americans, but you do have to rely on the Soviets quite a bit more, because you don't have very good armor. In fact, you have no armor. Armor is not an optimal way to play with as Japan, because you don't necessarily get the best advisors for armor. You don't get very good national focuses when it comes to actually building and researching armor, if you want to maintain a good infantry. And as I said multiple times before that, infantry is where it's at when you're playing as Japan. So it's very feasible, it's very good in some situations. For example, I think the Japanese have a very good time of actually beating the Germans and Italians in Africa because of the grind and the leveled up generals that they do get from China. However, and also they have a really good time in destroying the Axis navy for some reason. Maybe because their navy is just better than the American navy. Hey, could be. But also, I think if you choose some correct advisors, your navy is just better in some situations. And the base strike doctrine is quite well suited to fighting in the Atlantic, obviously, as well as the Japanese navy in this situation can focus its entirety on the Atlantic without having to fight a two-front naval war. So we do also relieve the British in this way. And it's not like I was artificially keeping the Americans out of the war. By any rule of the game, they could have justified on Germany. But the AI doesn't do that, especially historical AI, because they're waiting for the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor or the Philippines, and we're just not gonna do that because that's not the way we're playing. So it's not like I kept the Americans out of the war, I just didn't invade them, so they never joined. So it's entirely the Americans' fault that they didn't actually get to join and that the Germans lasted this long. But I think if the Americans joined, then we would have an even worse supply situation in France. So give and take. But definitely an interesting experience. And definitely feasible, however, not optimal. However, there is another front to the Second World War. That's right, we're going back to 1936 and doing the entire experiment over, however this time fighting with infantry and the entire armed forces on the Eastern Front, along with the Soviet Union against the Axis. This should be quite a different story, because I do think, and I do honestly think, that the infantry base that Japan has available to it is much more suited to something like fighting on the Eastern Front, just because of the massive potential that Japan has, the Japanese infantry has, and the entire Japanese army has when coming out of China, when it comes to the low supply areas that are very much present on the Eastern Front, and the large areas really don't tend to be as dominated by tanks, for example. Now in France, of course, there's a lot of lowlands, there's a lot of flatlands, and that's an area that's very, very nice for panzers, especially if you have such good panzers as the Germans do, or tanks, more rather, as the Germans do. On the Eastern Front, while the Blitzkrieg initially, or Operation Barbarossa and the Bewegungskrieg that the Germans adopted, was very, very, very neat for them when it comes to the various lowlands that are on the western part of the Soviet Union. When it comes to the central part, for example, the marshes, the more colder areas when it comes to winter, the areas that get really tough for tanks, around Moscow, a little bit of west of Moscow, and definitely around the Stalingrad area, and in general in the southern regions of the Soviet Union in general, towards the Caucasus Mountains. The Caucasus, more rather. I think the Japanese infantry has a lot of potential to just bite and hold in those various areas, and eventually counterattack with the support, or more rather supporting the Soviets, because it's obvious that the Soviets would have more soldiers in the Soviet Union than the Japanese would have in the Soviet Union. But the Japanese in this situation act more as a supporting force, whereas in France, as you could see in the previous sort of test, quote-unquote test, it was usually me who initiated all the offensives, and the Allies, the British, the Canadians, everyone like that, even the French to a certain extent, were there mostly just as an annoyance for me, because we got bottlenecked, they were bottlenecking my supply lines, and it was really, really annoying. And I think the Soviet Union presents a much better case for someone like Japan. And obviously in the scenario where we tried out communist New Zealand, which I do believe that you should check out, because it's a very interesting video and showcases sort of different viewpoint of fighting on the Eastern Front as a minor nation. But in this case, when it comes to the Japanese infantry and the Japanese army, I do think that they have a much more potential, because it's an army that's geared towards this type of fighting. It's an army that's geared towards the fighting in China. Of course, the Japanese in this game just completely dominate China if Japan is controlled by a player, and even if China itself is also controlled by a player. And I think it should go very nicely. But since we're running this experiment back, and we're starting at the beginning of the Second World War era, or 1936, as it's said in this game, you definitely know what's coming up. That's right, Operation China Sensei no Baka is ready to go, but first we have to escalate once, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Let's do this. Alright, it's time to jump into the war on the Eastern Front now, because as I thought about this whole situation over and over again, it seems like my predictions were somewhat accurate. I thought that the Japanese would have an extreme advantage on the Eastern Front compared to someone like New Zealand, obviously, or even any other great power, or, well, I suppose major power you could call them, for example, like America or the United States, the United Kingdom, or not the United States. So I thought that the Japanese would have a significant advantage because of the basically ceiling that the quality of their infantry can go to. As it turns out, if you actually want really good infantry, there's only a limited amount that you can produce before the Eastern Front fully breaks out. And so because the combat is not as limited as the Western Front, or basically France and Africa, you do really have to stretch your lines very thin, and so the Japanese force becomes either an extremely concentrated, heavily concentrated force on, for example, the Baltic region or the Romanian front or the sort of central front on the route to Moscow or from Moscow, or if you try to focus on the entirety of the front, then your line for the first year or two of Operation Barbarossa, or the initial attack of the Germans into the Soviet Union, because it becomes extremely stretched, and you really have to manage your resources. So you have to really micro intensively. However, the silver lining in that is that the Russians or the Soviets usually tend to occupy the entirety of the front, obviously, because it's their main front they're fighting on. So your force, while it's stretched thinly, it can still serve a supporting role because it's of such high quality compared to usually the various Axis infantry units, or even the German infantry units, for example. They tend not to be as good as their tanks, because obviously even the German AI tends to focus more on panzers and tank warfare, as well as their supply lines being stretched due to having to fight in Africa, for example. And so what you tend to find out is that even though you're stretched very thinly, you still manage to keep the front somewhat more stable than it otherwise would be, because the Russian infantry is more about obviously quantity than quality. And so it serves sort of a supporting role in the quality sense, while even being extremely stretched thinly. And so whenever the Russians go for the attack, you can really support the initial attack by the Soviet infantry by just landing that decisive punch. You're also very good at pinning. If you go for, even if with a 7-2, this was mostly done on the 7-2, and I imagine would be even better with 40 width infantry with extensive fire support, or extensive artillery support, I mean. And but the one major issue that I found while playing this is I overestimated the supply the supply mechanics, or the supply advantage that the Japanese would have, because it seems that the everlasting glitch that every time I run into, with the infantry just not willing to follow orders and just sitting in the back, is very much present even on the Eastern Front. Now, what's sort of more beneficial is that you can create sort of a reserve force out of these infantrymen that aren't willing to fight on the front lines due to the supply not being as good, because the Russians obviously have their entire force there, and the Soviet AI is not going to abandon their front just because you have a couple of infantry units that you want to bring, for example, like 10. It's much more beneficial even to the players to not waste their manpower while fighting on the Eastern Front if the Russians are able to cover it successfully, obviously, with your support, indeed. But if you were to bring the 40 width infantry that I talked about like a couple of minutes ago, or a couple of seconds ago, whatever, if you were to bring the 40 width infantry into this conflict, into this Eastern Front situation, I think you really have to focus on either the Baltic or the Central or the Southern Front, and you really can't sort of stretch your lines very thinly, because what tends to happen is that the infantry just won't go there, because some regions don't have as great a supply as others. So you might want to focus more on the Baltic, because the Baltic tends to have better supply than, for example, Central Russia or the central of the Soviet Union. Now in this game, because we because obviously I, formed the Scandinavian Empire. Also in this game, it's basically a perfect sort of simulation. I did everything that I did on the Western Front section. I also, copied into this little section here in the Eastern Front. So we have to deal with the Scandinavian Empire. What you tend to find is that the very northern front between the Soviet Union, which managed to puppet Finland in this game for some reason, and the front between them and the Scandinavian Empire tends to be rather interesting. There's even more supply, and the Soviets tend to, of course, because it's, you tend to find that the Scandinavians managed to invade Finland quite successfully. The initial punch of the Axis into the Soviet Union is extremely powerful. In any situation, the Soviets are very unprepared, so even the northern front usually tends to collapse. So if you were to run this exact simulation I'm running right here, you would tend to find that the Japanese here do have an advantage, because while you might suffer from the supply situation, the Axis AI tends to just pump in an absurd amount of infantry into this northern front, so you get in sort of really nice encirclements. But so the supply situation sort of 70% of what I expected. I expected it to be completely fine for the Japanese. You just roll up in there with like 100 divisions and you're just completely fine. Well, it turns out you only can roll up into the Eastern Front with like 70 divisions, because the supply, while it's better than on the Western Front, if the entirety of the British Empire just piles into France and completely bottlenecks their supply, it's still not as nice as, for example, fighting in, I don't know, Germany itself. And once you do actually break out of the Soviet Union, you go into the more central regions of Europe, and even Southern Europe, even the Balkans, you do tend to find that your supply is amazing there, and that's really where the Japanese tend to be quite perfect for this situation, because their infantry is so well geared towards sort of a grindy fight, because their percentages of attack and defense are so high because of all the passive bonuses, and your generals being very skilled from the war in China, which, grinding in China is sort of the key aspect to the historical fascist route if you want to play a proper historical Japan. Then your infantry, once you break out of the Soviet Union, sort of the deadlock of the most western part of the Soviet Union, the sort of eastern Poland, western Belarus part, it really becomes quite easy. It becomes almost just a complete stompage of the Axis forces, because while you have no tanks, so you can't really perform major operations, major encirclements, major sort of deep battle tactics, just sort of Banzai charging the enemy, or Soviet charging the enemy, or rather, becomes quite a breeze almost, because what tends to happen is that because the Soviets have an additional supporting force on the Eastern Front, let's say an additional 50 to 70 divisions, the Germans just can't break through, and because your infantry is so much better than the Russian infantry, it becomes even tougher for them to break through, and so the Operation Barbarossa just inevitably fails. Obviously, it just fails. They just have no chance of actually breaking through, so they continually waste themselves against your lines, which upgrades your divisions even further, and it definitely upgrades the Russian divisions even further as well, or just upgrades them baseline, because the Russians tend to have really poor generals when it comes to the initial stages of Operation Barbarossa. So between the Western Front and the African Front and the Eastern Front, I would say that the easiest is the African Front. That's definitely the easiest, because you're mostly going to be facing Italians there, and mostly facing Italian infantry. And Italian infantry, compared to Japanese infantry, is just like trash. The Italian infantry is probably the least powerful infantry of the entirety of the Axis, if they're not really planning on just playing a very defensive game. Playing as Italy successfully in this situation, I think, would be very difficult, because you really have to fight a World War I-esque situation, and really not necessarily break out of Northern Africa into Central Africa. You really have to sort of like almost give up on Ethiopia if you're Italy in this situation. We also have to face Japanese infantry. because obviously a majority of your allies are focused within Europe. So the easiest front is the African front, because while the supply situation might not be as favorable to you, it's definitely even less favorable for the Italians, and because their infantry is so much worse, you just wreck them. Even the Vichy French just stand no chance against you. The Western Front, definitely the worst front to fight, because I don't know why the Allied AI is so passive. They almost never actually engage in any sort of offensive operations on the mainland of Europe, or they don't directly invade the mainland of Europe. They almost never do that. In this game, the British successfully invaded the Portuguese quite often, or 2 out of 2 times they managed to successfully invade the Portuguese within like the first 3 months of the Portuguese joining the conflict on the Axis side, which was quite interesting. I really didn't expect that, but they tend to avoid Normandy, and they tend to avoid invading France for some reason, even after Barbarossa begins, which is very curious. I think that's very curious, and you do definitely see this as well when you're playing as Germany. The British almost never tend to invade. It's almost like it's always the Americans that do this, which might be some sort of, AI, something, whatever. But if you find yourself in this situation as the Japanese in this exact scenario, fighting on the Western Front, you have to essentially play the role of the Americans, which is the initial invasion, the initial stages of the invasion, of breaking out of the beaches of Normandy or Brest, let's say, or Brittany more rather, is it's extremely easy, because you have the potential of having really, really, really good marines. Your amphibious operations can be very smooth, your infantry is very powerful. But actually, fighting in France tends to turn into a World War I-esque deadlock, where you just have very, very limited space within which you can actually perform offensive operations, and you just tend to completely get deadlocked. It's sort of a grindy war, never really goes anywhere. You have to essentially wait for the Russians to do everything. Whereas fighting on the Eastern Front, it's like the second easiest. It's like the middle ground, but it's actually really easy. So because you essentially have very similar benefits to fighting in China. Except that, you're sort of on side of the Japanese this time. It's sort of, it's weird, but it's sort of easy because you have really good infantry. If you actually go with the Grand Battle Plan Doctrine, you have really good defense. You can really support the Soviets and just go from there. If you're sort of playing a standard historical Japanese, and obviously you can stack your infantry in whichever direction you want to. You can play, if you want to have sort of an easier time, even in France or even in the Eastern Front, superior firepower doctrine would probably, I think it would definitely be much better, because you have sort of more offensive opportunities. Whereas if you're playing a strictly historical Japanese game, then which we are doing right here, then it's much sort of a much more complex situation. I would suppose you can't just Banzai charge them endlessly, but you can definitely Banzai charge them after sort of mitigating the initial push of the Axis. So I think it's sort of interesting the way this whole situation played out. Definitely didn't expect this. I definitely expected the Western Front initially to be much easier when I first sort of started this. I suppose the initial game, the initial test of the capabilities of the Japanese Imperial Army. I definitely expected the Western Front to be complete breeze after Operation Barbarossa began. I expected the Eastern Front to be more of a grind, but as it turns out, the Japanese army is actually well suited to a grind. So, anyway, as it turns out, the Eastern Front is actually kind of pathetically easy in this situation, even with the Axis being very, very strong when it comes to the sort of mainland forces. And over the entirety of the Eastern Front, you do see basically the fascist Greeks, even some Portuguese divisions, I think, and definitely the Scandinavian Empire playing a very large role. And I think that if the Soviets didn't have the forces of Japan on their side here, they would probably have lost quite a bit earlier than they tend to do with a strong Axis. In this game also the Yugoslavians joined the Axis forces, so that added to basically the entirety of the Balkan being against the Soviet Union. So it really goes to show that the Japanese infantry and the Japanese army is very versatile. However, it can't perform just anywhere. It has to have sort of a set goal in mind and a set strategy in mind. And I think that really just sort of plays into the base strategy that you do with Japan is, you take over China, sort of an easy fight. Then you take on the Indians, and you try to fight a naval war. In this situation, instead of fighting the Indians and a very poor infrastructure regions of Asia and India, we were fighting on the poor infrastructure regions of Russia, Central Russia, Western Russia, and then obviously when you get to the much better infrastructure areas, the Japanese infrastructure smacks the Axis, which obviously they wouldn't have been as easy if we were fighting without the Soviets, so just Japan fighting on the Eastern Front. That would have been, I think, really difficult, but obviously that's not the scenario we're playing with here, and I think you would really have to gear your army towards something like that. So immediately, for example, conscripting the entirety of Japan by creating a Japanese puppet and just using their forces. I think that would be, that's a very valid strategy, but that would mean that you can't really make use of the best infantry, and there would be no real point in doing something like this. So I think this whole, I suppose, I don't know what you call it, test? I think it's a test. I think it really goes to show just how versatile Japan is as a nation within Hearts of Iron 4, even after the whole revamp of like their focus tree, trying to make these individual focus decisions more geared towards a certain playstyle. With Japan, you can just do anything. Same with Italy, you can just do anything, and I think these games really, just showcase something like this. Even if you pick the Persia de Konoha faction decision, I think you're still, going with the strongest option, because after you take over China, which is sort of a necessity for Japan, if you're going with the Konoha faction thing, even if you, take over China, and after you take over China, you're essentially, just a little bit less powerful than, let's say, the Soviet Union when it comes to industry. And you definitely have the most manpower potential out of any country in the game, alongside a very, very, very strong infantry base when it comes to their stat lines and the percentages of attack and defense. If you were to go a more sort of ambitious route, I think you would go with the superior firepower doctrine instead of the Grand Battle Plan doctrine. But I try to showcase more of a historical setting Japan here. So we did go for some naval upgrades, even though it wasn't quite as important. But Japan is sort of geared towards more of a naval game. So trying to adapt these strategies to the fighting in Europe to the best of my abilities was sort of the main goal within this short series. Or this video of the short series where we try out different tactics with Japan, and I think this one serves as the baseline of what the extreme amount of potential and extreme amount of strength Japan has. And I think the rest of the videos within the series, which will be the democratic Japan and communist Japan, trying to again fight on the Western Front as democratic Japan, join the Allies, see what's up with them, if they possibly have a different situation after you don't take over the entirety of China, and focus more on the decisions and the the sort of abilities to expand provided within the democratic focus tree. And then communist Japan, which again is a completely different beast, but we'll try and do that and fight on the Eastern Front. So this serves, I think, as a good baseline, is that the fascist Japan path, the Purge the Konoha faction path, is probably the best one out of all of them, even when you're trying to take on the Axis. They're also the best one when you're trying to take on the Soviets. They're also the best one when you're trying to take on the Americans and the British, and basically anyone. So, fascist path, so far, in my opinion, which, it's just my opinion, but I think it's sort of an educated opinion, at least a little bit. I think it's probably the best and most flexible nation in the entire game when it comes to the opportunities and the just various style of gameplay that you can employ with them. And I think they're also the most fun, but that's again just my opinion. And then we'll have to see in future videos how the democratic side goes and how the communist side goes. I don't think we'll be doing the support the Konoha faction much, because it's sort of it's a different beast. We can try. I suppose we'll try it out as well, because that could be interesting as well. We try to take over the Soviets with the Germans help and then turn on the Germans. That could be an interesting strategy. But yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know, the war isn't done yet, but we can see that it's 1942. We're almost at the gates of Berlin. It's basically done. I can already tell you this is post-commentary. We do win the war in the end, but I suppose I'll show it anyway. So yeah, there we go, almost completely capitulated Italy, the last major power within the Axis sphere, and a majority of the casualties taken by the Axis were from the Empire of Japan, or just Japan in general, and not from the Soviets, so you really can see just how much power a good Japanese player has when fighting on the Eastern Front, with all the bonuses that the Japanese infantry do have. So I do think that this was a successful test of the capabilities of the Japanese infantry, or Japan in general, when fighting against the Axis in a variety of fronts. Next video will be showcasing the abilities of democratic Japan when taking on the Axis in France and in Africa and in various fronts like that. So, anyway, thank you guys for watching, and see you next time.